Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Apocrypha Apocalypse. I'm Gary Machuda. If you're a veteran to this channel, you know that we try to release videos every Friday. Well, it turns out this Friday is Good Friday. And so I wanted to give a special video that will be released on Good Friday that will touch on the Passion and also connect the Deuterocanon. So this is almost a no-brainer because there is an extended prophecy in the Book of Wisdom, which is also known as the Wisdom of Solomon, that gives a detailed account of the Passion from the viewpoint of Christ's enemy. And this has remarkable correspondences with the New Testament. That's what we're going to unpack today on the Apocrypha Apocalypse. So fasten your seatbelts, folks, for the Apocrypha Apocalypse is about to begin. In my book, The Case for the Deuterocanon, I give a layered, multi-strand, cumulative argument for the Deuterocanon. One of those strands is what I call prophetic nature of the Deuterocanon. Namely, there are things that are spoken of in these books that go beyond that which can be known through natural human reason. And one big element of that is Wisdom chapter 2. Wisdom 2, even though it's only a few verses that we're going to consider, nevertheless, it is packed with prophecies about Jesus's suffering and death and ultimately resurrection, told mainly through the eyes of his persecutors. And when you compare Wisdom 2 to the New Testament, you find there's all sorts of remarkable correspondences. So that's what I want to do for our special Good Friday edition of the Apocrypha Apocalypse. I want to look at Wisdom 2 and show all these different points of contact it has where the New Testament verifies what was prophesied in this book. So, without further ado, why don't we jump to the Book of Wisdom, beginning with verse 12. It reads, quote, "Let us beset the just one, because he is obnoxious to us. He sets himself against our doings, reproaches us for transgressions of the law, and charges us with violations of our training." Now, this one little verse, you could probably think of dozens of verses in the Gospels where you could see these words being fulfilled. For example, in Matthew 23, verse 1 through 3, Jesus is speaking to the crowds and the disciples saying, quote, "The scribes and the Pharisees have taken their seat on the chair of Moses. Therefore, do and observe whatever they tell you to do. But do not follow their example, for they preach, but they do not practice." That would be a reproach, would it not? Also, John 7:19. "Did not Moses give you the law? Yet none of you keeps the law. Why are you trying to kill me?" And there's numerous examples of where Jesus insults the scribes, the Pharisees, and so on, in a way that he's speaking to their ignorance, that they have not trained properly in the sacred material. For example, in Matthew 12:2, Jesus says, "Have you not read what David did?" Now think about how insulting that is. He's talking to scholars, he's talking to scribes, their livelihoods is right dealing with the scriptures. And for him to say, "Did you not read David?" Well, of course they read David. But really what he's saying is they have transgressed the law and their training isn't as good as they think. Matthew 12:5, "Have you not read in the law?" Ooh, that's a huge insult. I mean, like I said, their livelihood is to study the law. Matthew 19:4, he said in reply, "Have you not read that in the beginning the Creator made them male and female?" Yeah, again, it's like, haven't you studied Genesis? Mark 12:26, As for the dead being raised, have you not read in the book of Moses? So repeatedly, you have Jesus pointing out that they have violations in their training. Matthew 15:5 and 6 says, but you say, whoever says to father or mother, any support you might have had from me is dedicated to God, need not honor his father. You have nullified the word of God for the sake of your tradition. In other words, they are violating the law. So Wisdom 2:12, you can see that being lived out technicolor in the New Testament. Let's move. That's just one verse. Let's move on to verse 13. He professes to have knowledge of God and styles himself a child of the Lord. Boy, this, I almost don't even feel like I need to go to the New Testament. Anybody familiar with the New Testament can see the connection here with Wisdom 2:13. He professes to have knowledge of God and styles himself a child of God. Now, obviously, any pious Jew would profess to have knowledge of God. So the book of wisdom, the enemies here being portrayed in Wisdom 2, I should say, is finding this particular person very odious because he apparently claims to have some special knowledge of God. And that special knowledge of God is styled in a way that he is God's child. Okay. So I think that is very interesting. And of course, it can be seen all over the New Testament. For example, Matthew 11:27, Jesus tells us that he has an exclusive, unique relationship with the Father. He says, no one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son wishes to reveal him. Again, that certainly speaks to some sort of unique, proprietary knowledge of God that's only for this particular person. And notice it's also styled as a son. John 10:15, just as the Father knows me and I know the Father, I will lay down my life for the sheep. Again, this knowledge that Christ has of the Father is unique, styled as son. John 20:50, and I know that his commandment is eternal life. So what I say as the Father told me. So he possesses divine revelation from the Father. He has specific, unique knowledge of the Father being his Son. All of that, I think, is amazing correspondence with Wisdom 2:13. To us, he is the censor of our thoughts. Merely to see him is a hardship for us. This is interesting about censoring thoughts because Jesus repeatedly knows the hearts of his audience. In Matthew 9:4, Jesus says, Jesus knew what they were, excuse me, John says this. Jesus knew what they were thinking and said, why do you harbor evil thoughts? Mark 2:8, Jesus immediately knew in his mind what they were thinking to themselves, and he said, why are you thinking such things in your hearts? And also Luke 11:17, but he knew their thoughts, and he said to them, every kingdom divided against itself will lay waste, and house will fall against house. So you see, even the secret thoughts of his enemies was not hidden from Jesus. And Jesus calls them out repeatedly for their wicked thoughts. Verse 15, because his life was not like other men's, and different are his ways. Again, boy, this is seen all over the New Testament. For example, Matthew 7:28-29, when Jesus finished those words, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as their scribes. So they see that even the way Jesus gives his teachings, that is categorically different than the teachers of the day. Again, his way is not like others. Matthew 15:1 and 2, Then the scribes and the Pharisees came to Jesus from Jerusalem and said, "Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders?" So the disciples are acting differently. That's because they're being taught by their rabbi, their master, who is acting differently. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. We could give lots and lots of verses, but I don't want this to be a very long video. I just want to have kind of a meditative approach to wisdom too, as a little help for Good Friday. Verse 16, he judges us the base. He holds aloof of our paths as from things impure. This has really cool connections with Matthew 23, where Jesus says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You cleanse the outside of cup and dish, and inside you're full of plunder and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee, cleanse first the inside of the cup, so that the outside also may be clean." In other words, they appear clean on the outside, but really inside they're impure. Continuing in the same chapter, it says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You're like whitewashed tombs, which appear beautiful on the outside, but inside's full of dead men's bones and every kind of filth." Talk about Jesus being aloof from these scholars of law, these leaders of the people, precisely because spiritually they're unclean. I mean, it's hard to see how somebody could miss this connection with Jesus. He calls blessed the destiny of the just and boasts that God is his Father. Well, Jesus does call the saints blessed. They're destined for heaven. Matthew 5:10 through 12. Blessed are they who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when you insult you and persecute you and utter every kind of evil against you falsely because of me. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward will be great in heaven. Thus they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So, yes, Jesus does bless the destiny of the just. And we don't have to, I think, go over boasting God as Father, but we'll just have just one verse for you on that one. And John 8:18 through 19, I testify on my behalf, and so does the Father who sent me. So they said to him, "Where is your Father?" Jesus answered, "You know neither me nor my Father. For if you knew me, you would know my Father also." One verse, two lines. We have a lot of very powerful correspondence in the New Testament. Moving on to Wisdom 2:17 and 18. Let us see whether his words be true. Let us find out what will happen to him. For if the just one be the Son of God, he will defend him and deliver him from the hands of his foes. Now, folks, you're probably very familiar with the fulfillment of this. I've done a couple of videos on the channel to talk about this because I think this is a really powerful proof to show that wisdom was considered sacred and prophetic. And that is Matthew 27:43. Jesus is on the cross. The crowds are jeering and chanting against him. It's interesting because the crowds start off by saying, "Save yourself. Come down from the cross. We'll believe in you." Right? But when the scribes and Pharisees join in verse 43, they take that jeer, and no longer are they telling Jesus, "Come down from the cross and we'll believe in you." Now they want God to witness whether or not he is who he says he is. Okay? Now think of Wisdom 2, what we just read. Let us see whether his words are true. Let us find out what will happen to him. For if the just one be the Son of God, he will defend him and deliver him from the hands of his foes. You can see there in Wisdom 2 this idea that they're going to do something to the just one just to see what will happen to him. because if he is the Son of God, God will deliver him. That's precisely what the Pharisees, scribes, and priests say at Jesus at the foot of the cross. He saved others, he cannot save himself. So this is the King of Israel. Let him come down from the cross now and we'll believe in him. He trusted in God. Let him, that is God, deliver him now if he wants him. For he said, I am the Son of God. So this fits so perfectly with wisdom too. And like I said, I go at length going through different options and showing the connections between this two. If you're interested, just type in Matthew 27:43 in the search area and check it out for yourselves. But this this comes true. In fact, the chief priests, scribes, and elders actually use wisdom too at the foot of the cross. But there's other ones too. And this one is kind of interesting because, again, what's the context? Finding out whether this one's the Son of God by torturing him, by killing him. That's what Wisdom 2 is talking about. At the foot of the cross, of course, after Jesus dies, the centurion looks, all this phenomenon happens after he dies, and he cries out, Jesus cries out to the Father. And when the centurion who was facing him saw how he breathed his last, he said, truly, this man was the Son of God. Again, fits perfectly with wisdom too, right? The Son of God. But I want you to see this in a parallel in Luke 23:47. Luke records the word slightly different. Now, when the centurion saw what was done, he glorified God, saying, certainly, this was a righteous man. In Greek, it's actually a little shorter. It's like, surely this is the righteous one. But notice how Son of God is juxtaposed with the parallel with the righteous one. So you notice here that those two halves are part of wisdom to 17:18. Why? Because if the just one be the Son of God, John 15 affirms Jesus is the Son of God. Luke 23:47 affirms that he is the just one. It's like two halves of the same coin, both affirming Jesus. And the connecting point for both is wisdom too. With revilement and torture, let us put him to the test that we may have proof of his gentleness and try his patience. Now, for this, actually, there's many different passages, but there's a couple of passages that stuck out to me. Maybe you have better ones. But I was thinking of James 5:6, where it says, you have condemned, you have murdered the righteous one. Again, there's that righteous one. He offers you no resistance. So Jesus, when being scourged and beaten, did not open his mouth. He didn't revile his enemies. He was like a lamb that was dumb, right? It didn't make any sound when it was led to the slaughter. That's the patience and the gentleness of Jesus that's spoken of here in Wisdom 2:19. Also in Hebrews 12:2 says, after talking about the cloud of witnesses that were listed in Hebrews 11, it says, keeping our eyes fixed on Jesus, the leader and perfecter of faith, for the sake of the joy that laid before him, he endured the cross, despising its shame, and had taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of God. Again, despising the shame of the cross, he endured it, right? Patient with patience and gentleness, he endured it. Let us condemn him to a shameful death, for according to his own words, God will take care of him. So when does Jesus say that God will take care of him? Well, he actually says it right there in the Passion, right? And then Jesus said to him, put your sword back into its sheath. For all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do not think that I cannot call upon my Father, and he will provide me at this moment with more than 12 legions of angels. So Jesus says at his command that God would take care of him with legions of angels. And there's other passages too where Jesus speaks about the help of the Father. These were their thoughts, but they erred, for their wickedness blinded them, and they knew not the hidden counsels of God. Neither did they count as a recompense the holiness, nor discern the innocent soul's reward. In other words, their wickedness had blinded the enemies of Christ from recognizing who he truly is. And they also didn't consider the recompense of holiness and the reward in which the just one were to receive. And you can see different echoes of this in the New Testament. For example, 1 Corinthians 2, 7, and 8 says, rather we speak of God's wisdom, interesting enough, mysterious, hidden, which God predetermined before the ages for our glory, and which none of the rulers of the age knew. For if they had known it, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. So this, I think, speaks to the fact that their wickedness had blinded them so that they actually carry out what God had planned from the beginning of the ages. Again, other passages could be brought to bear on that, but I think that suffices. Nor discern the innocent soul's reward, which, of course, what's the reward for the passion? It's the resurrection. And interesting enough, this too speaks to wisdom too. Remember, if the just one be the Son of God, God will rescue him from the hands of his foes. Well, Paul says something very mysterious in Romans 1, 3 through 4. And this is a passage that scholars have some difficulty with, trying to understand the line of thought. So let me read this first. Paul says, the gospel about his son descended from David according to the flesh, but established as Son of God in power, according to the Spirit of holiness through the resurrection of the dead, Jesus Christ our Lord. Now, Jesus' divine sonship is manifested in the resurrection. That's true. But what does it mean that it's established that he is the Son of God? I think personally that comes from Matthew 27:43, that taunt of the Pharisees, drawing on Wisdom 2:18. If the just one be the Son of God, God will rescue him. Of course, the chief priests, scribes, and elders at the foot of the cross were thinking God would rescue him from the cross, right? That God would actually take Jesus down from the cross and save him. But if that were the case, then we would not be redeemed. That was not what God's plan was, that we just read about, that their wickedness had blinded them from. It was Jesus' mission to die on the cross so that the Father could have an even greater rescue of Jesus. And that is the resurrection of Christ's body and the glorification of Christ's body on the third day. That is a far greater rescue than had the chief priests, scribes, and elders' words come true. Because after all, if someone's on the verge of death and you save them, that's one thing. But if someone dies and you save them, that's a far greater, infinitely greater, I think, miracle. That tends to be overlooked, although there are a lot of Protestant Bibles that have cross references to this. Older Protestant Bibles, back when they actually had the Book of Wisdom in their Old Testaments. Again, I've done a video on those cross references if you're interested. And then continuing on, now this seems to be a change in thought, but it actually corresponds perfectly in light of Jesus. Because here we have these enemies saying, let's put him to a shameful death, let's torture, revile him, or if he be the Son of God, he's the just one, then God will rescue him. And then all of a sudden starts talking about Adam. So where's the connection between the two? It's like completely off the reservation. Is this a different prophecy? Well, actually, I think it's kind of diving deeper into the mystery of Christ's death and resurrection because ultimately he dies and is resurrected as the new Adam. And so I think the Book of Wisdom prophetically immediately goes into a contemplation about the first man, Adam, which of course also speaks to the second Adam, Jesus Christ. Wisdom says, "For God formed man to be imperishable, the image of his own nature he had made him." And it's interesting, Hebrews 2, 5, and 8, quoting Psalm 8, applies it to Jesus. And this is argument that Jesus is greater than the angels. But it's interesting they take Psalm 8 because Psalm 8, if you read it, it's talking about Adam. So this passage in Psalm 8 applies to Adam, but it also applies to the Son. So let's read. This is Hebrews 2, 5 through 8. For it was not to the angels that he subjected the world to come, of which we are speaking. Instead, someone has testified somewhere, quote, "What is man that you are mindful of him, or the son of man that you should care for him? You made him for a little while lower than the angels. You crowned him with glory and honor, subjecting all things under his feet. In subjecting all things to him, he left nothing not subject to him. Yet at present, we do not see all things subject to him." So I find that very interesting that Hebrews makes this connection of Jesus and Adam. They're both crowned with glory. They're subjecting all things under their feet. Again, Genesis 3:15 imagery. And he says that we see him in glory, but we still have to see him, all things being subjected under him. Another passage too that you might be familiar with that connects Adam with Jesus. And this is very interesting because again, it fits with the crucifixion and ultimately the resurrection because Jesus is raised for our justification, is Romans 5:18 and 19. It says, quote, "In conclusion, just as through one transgression condemnation came upon all," now that's talking about the transgression of Adam, which brings about condemnation to all his offspring. "So through the righteous act of acquittal and life came to all." Of course, that is Christ's death on the cross and resurrection. "For just as through the disobedience of the one person the many were made sinners, so through the obedience of the one the many will be made righteous." Again, connecting Jesus, the new Adam, to Adam in the garden, how Adam's disobedience and transgression brings condemnation and sin. Jesus's obedience brings about acquittal and life and making us righteous. So you can see even where it seems like wisdom too makes a transgression, it really is still connected with Jesus, is still part of that prophetic thought. And finally it continues, "But by the envy of the devil, death entered the world, and they who are in his possession experience it." So as we learn in Genesis 3, it's through the envy of the devil that death enters into the world through Adam's disobedience. And by that, we are under the dominion of the devil. Jesus' obedience frees us from the law of sin and death and frees us from the power of the devil. And ultimately, will free us from death when? At the resurrection. 1 John 3:8 says, "Whoever sins belongs to the devil, but because the devil has sinned from the beginning, indeed, the Son of Man was revealed to destroy the works of the devil." So that's it. We're freed from that dominion of the devil who are freed from death ultimately through Christ's passion, death, and resurrection. So you have glimmers of the resurrection here, along with tying it with Adam. All right, we're going to stop right there. That is the end of Wisdom 2. And I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you wouldn't mind, we would appreciate it if you could maybe leave some comments in the comment boxes below. Also, if you haven't subscribed, love to have you on board. Give a thumbs up. And I wish everybody a happy Holy Triduum and have a blessed Easter. And God willing, next Friday, we'll be right back doing another video. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.